how does Dr. Seuss's The Lorax, Jimmy Kimmel, a pro-trans bill in Colorado, and the First Amendment all tie in together? Well, I'll tell you in this week's episode of Liberty Legion.
Welcome to Liberty Legion, where sensibility rises above radicalism and liberty stands above all. Join us as we bring common sense back into the conversation for freedom and for the future. Now here's your host, Aaron.
I'm Erin Brantley. Welcome back to the Liberty Legion podcast. If you haven't already, please do subscribe, share, comment, leave a review. All of this engagement helps me out immensely, and I genuinely appreciate you being here. Let's jump into it. This week, we're going to chat about the First Amendment, basics, free speech, all of that good stuff. Then we'll go into the Jimmy Kimmel and FCC controversy, as that raised a bunch of First Amendment discussion. We'll also talk about a pro-trans bill in Colorado that I believe is compelled speech from the state government. And finally, we'll wrap it into how this all relates back to the wonderful story of the Lorax. All right, let's get started. In 1765, standing in the Virginia House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry dared to compare King George III to tyrants of history. He said Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III. At that moment, shouts of treason filled the chamber, but Henry didn't back down. He knew that without the right to speak freely, even dangerously, liberty itself could not survive. And that's exactly why our founding fathers in the United States put the First Amendment first in the Bill of Rights. Because if government can control speech or silence your voice, it can take every other right with it. There's no denying that. Benjamin Franklin especially was quoted as saying, and especially believed in the First Amendment, he was quoted as saying, "Without the freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech." His own brother had been jailed for publishing anti-government material, and so Benjamin Franklin was a staunch believer in free speech, along with all the other founding fathers. They understood that it is vital for a thriving democracy to limit the government's influence on speech. Now let's read the actual text from the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So the First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition. And like I mentioned, it's the foundation of all other freedoms. Without freedom of speech and all these other protected freedoms in the First Amendment, citizens can't meaningfully hold the government accountable, challenge laws, or advocate for change. It's the ultimate check on government overreach. And if you hand over the reins and allow the government to decide what speech is harmful, what do you think they would likely go to first? It's going to be any speech that they don't like, which is at the whim of whoever's in charge at that time. Incredibly dangerous, because you're going to lose accountability. You're going to lose bringing attention to social issues that desperately need change. And that's how the other rights tumble behind. And another thing that Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes spoke about was that it guarantees that bad ideas can be countered by good ideas instead of being suppressed. So a marketplace of ideas, which is what Charlie Kirk was actively engaging in. And I think many of us believe is key to coming up with the best solutions in our country, hashing out major issues that we're facing, is civil public discourse. So we do not want to hand that over because, again, that is something that every citizen should have a right to engage in peacefully and without any type of attack from the government. So, and we know this from like historical authoritarian regimes, right? Is freedom of speech is the first to go. You lose it. You see this in Nazi Germany. You saw this in the USSR. So very important that we preserve freedom of speech. What the First Amendment doesn't cover is private businesses. So if you post something on social media, like celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk or something especially vile, your company can fire you. You have a protection from the government compelling or chilling or influencing your speech, not from private companies making choices. And the First Amendment's constantly being tested by our federal and state government. We'll give an example and we'll go into the Jimmy Kimmel situation. And I have my opinions on this, so we'll flesh it out. But this all came about from Jimmy Kimmel's comments in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination. What he said, what his quote exactly was that caused all of this uproar, was the MAGA gang was desperately trying to characterize the kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them, and of trying to score political points from it. Now, by this point, we knew that this kid was not MAGA. And so to me, his statement is poorly worded. I think it's misleading. I think it's putting the entire spotlight on the right with taking no accountability on the left as far as dangerous rhetoric that could have led us or contributed to this boiling point, okay? But he has the right to say it. However, the networks also have a right to pull his show if they don't agree with what he's saying. Now, where the controversy came in regarding free speech was the FCC chair's Carr, so Carr is the FCC chair, his comments in response to Kimmel's. And he said, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. The individual licensed stations that are taking their content, it's time for them to step up and say this, garbage isn't something that we think serves the needs of our local communities. A critique to that is many saw that as a veiled threat of Carr trying to use his authority within a government agency to influence those stations and those broadcasters to watch their speech, or they could be silenced by the government and by FCC intervention. He did cite the public interest law, and I think that's a weak argument. It is there, and the FCC does have some authority in regards to that. But ultimately, Jimmy Kimmel was put back on the air. Now, Nexstar and Sinclair took the longest. They put him back on air as of September 26th. What Sinclair said specifically was, free speech provides broadcasters with the right to exercise judgment as to the content of their local stations. They also emphasized that this was independent of any government influence or interaction. So people don't believe that. Obviously, a lot of people on the left are upset. They saw this as a blatant First Amendment violation. I think it's difficult to confirm that if the stations didn't silence Kimmel because of the FCC chair's comments. They silenced him because they didn't agree with his comments, which the stations can do. But again, when you mix in Carr's comments, it can be seen as intimidation or a veiled threat or chilling speech, which is where you could potentially have some legal action. And we do have, some previous legal precedents around this. And I'll give you some of this context. I encourage you to go dive more deeply into these cases. I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty of them because I will bore you, I'm sure. But courts have repeatedly had to check regulators on pressuring companies to silence speech. You can see this in Bannon Books v. Sullivan, which was a 1963 Supreme Court case, which said informal censorship is unconstitutional. And it ruled that Rhode Island's commission's practice of informally threatening book distributors to remove objectionable publications was an unconstitutional system of prior restraint and censorship. You can also reference Backpage v. Dart, which talked about no coercion letters, NRA v. Vullo, I'm probably pronouncing that incorrect, it's VULLO, which said regulators can't pressure private companies to blacklist speech. You can dive deeper into the FCC's public interest rule if you'd like, their obligations, also their stance on mergers, because this has evolved over the years. We have seen many stations be centralized down to just a few. And a lot of them, the argument for is that they're pooling resources. So there's arguments whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And you can talk about, centralizing resources for these local stations, but it also maybe leaves less diversity in the voices and broadcasts that are available if they're only under a few big companies. But that's a conversation for a different day. Let's talk about state level infringements on free speech. And the example I'm going to give to you today is from my home state of Colorado. Lord knows Colorado loves to take First Amendment issues to the Supreme Court. We had the Baker with the lesbian couple or the gay couple who won. We had the website designer who refused to design a website for a gay couple. The web designer won. Colorado just loves to push the envelope and test its limits on free speech. And they're doing it again, which I would not be shocked if this gets to the Supreme Court. Or maybe a similar case will, and that it'll force Colorado to alter their law. So I'm talking about the Kelly-Loving Act, which has faced a lot of backlash in regards to compelled speech lawsuits. So again, the states are testing the same boundaries that the FCC is accused of testing at the national level. Let's get into it. The Kelly-Loving Act is HB 25-1312. It was passed in 2025 in Colorado by the Colorado State Legislature, majority Democrat, heavy Democrat state legislature, I'll say. And what it did is it amended the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act to make it a discriminatory act to intentionally refer to an individual by their birth name, which is dead naming, or incorrect pronouns, misgendering. And this prohibition against misgendering and dead naming applies to places of public accommodation, which can include workplaces, schools, and businesses. Like I mentioned, there's already challenges pending in the courts. If you want to check out some of these, you can go to fire.org. And that is I believe, I can't remember what it stands for, but essentially they're an advocacy organization who fights for free speech specifically in the courts, a legal advocacy organization. And they are framing this as unconstitutional compelled speech. Their central argument is that forcing individuals to use someone's preferred name or pronouns violates their right to free speech. And critics allege this is a form of compelled speech that the government cannot mandate. So this is illegal. And the issue is if you are found to be guilty of intentionally misgendering or mispronouncing, you can face fines and civil action from the state under their Anti-Discrimination Act. So they enshrined it in there. Also, another issue that's being challenged in the courts is the aspect of very vague terminology. So offensive language and frivolous purposes is used in the law to describe when a chosen name is not protected. And again, critics argue that these are too vague and could be interpreted arbitrarily. So we'll see how this plays out in the court. It is currently pending. These lawsuits have been filed. Again, this law has not been in place for very long. I think just a few months, under 6 months for sure. So I'll keep you guys posted as that lawsuit and those challenges unfold. A couple cases that you can reference is Janus v. AFSCME, which was a 2018 Supreme Court case. It wasn't about gender, but it was a landmark case on compelled speech, and the court ruled that the government cannot force public employees to pay union dues that support speech they disagree with. You can look at 303 Creative v. Elenis, which was a 2023. That's the web designer. Colorado could not compel speech that violated her beliefs. You have Woolley v. Maynard, 1977 Supreme Court case that said individuals cannot be forced to display slogans on license plates if it violates their beliefs. There is some case history on this, and I encourage you to go dive into those and see what you think and where this Kelly-Loving Act will fall. I think it is compelled speech. I don't think you can force someone to use your desired pronouns. I take a stance of personal responsibility with free speech, just like I do everything else. And that's, I think, one of my core conservative beliefs. If you allow someone to impact you that deeply by their speech, you're in a world of trouble. Like, people are not going to be kind to you all the time, and you need to be able to be strong in your convictions and confident enough to not allow it to completely destroy you. Now, obviously, there's certain speech that's not protected. That's incitement of violence, threats, defamation, slanderous statements, etc. But for the most part, if someone were to come up and call me a he or call me a name, I should not be able to then file a discrimination complaint and have the state step in to enforce that. All right, we will get to the Lorax comparison soon. I'm sure some of you are curious. I loved it, so we'll get there. First, let's kind of just wrap up what we went through. With the FCC v. Jimmy Kimmel, we saw pressure on broadcasters, or arguments that Carr's comments were pressure on broadcasters, and raised concerns about government overreach and corporate gatekeeping. On the state level, we saw the Kelly-Loving Act show how quickly speech can be criminalized when laws are vague or overbroad, and also laws that go against your constitutional right of free speech. Now, both sides illustrate why the First Amendment exists. Whether you believe Carr overstepped or you disagree with Colorado, both sides show the First Amendment exists to prevent federal or state from deciding what citizens can or cannot say. And again, I'm going to say this until I'm blue in the face. It is vital that we protect the First Amendment, whether or not your party is the one doing the attacking on free speech. Because if it feels like your team is winning in an attack on free speech, I can guarantee you that can switch as soon as someone else is in power. And we don't want that. We want to remain consistent. Free speech isn't about deciding what's popular. It's about protecting the right to dissent, to discuss, to criticize, to question, to challenge different ideas. That is what free speech is. And it's the ability to do all of that without any sort of government intervention or interference. I tend to lean almost to a free speech absolutist, which I take issue, and I think there's some challenge to be had with Trump and the State Department deporting people who are challenging Israel. However, if they are inciting violence, if they are threatening students, if they are disrupting the campus, if they are damaging property, I'm sorry, your visa can be revoked. You're a visitor here. Okay, so there are parameters there and guardrails, in my opinion. But if we allow carve-outs for bad speech, we're handing over the power to decide truth to those who are in charge. And we saw this even more recently with the Biden administration and Google coming out and saying they were pressured to censor certain accounts who were saying things about COVID. And that absolutely should not be allowed. That's something that I hope all Americans tuned into. We should not have the federal government contacting social media companies and asking them to censor American voices. You guys can say that it's a public company, but Google said, which is different than what Sinclair and Nexstar said with Kimmel, Google specifically said we did this because of pressure from the Biden administration. Huge First Amendment infringement, in my opinion. And I would hope that the left, even if they were Biden supporters, that they could see that. It's important that we're criticizing our own side and remaining objective, especially when we're discussing and challenging our constitutional rights. I do also want to highlight, and this is important, that historically, unpopular speech is exactly what needs protecting. So a lot of the reform movements or social reform movements in history that were necessary for our country, like the abolitionists, women's suffrage, civil rights, they were one-time speech or could have been classified as disruptive, offensive, or even dangerous by the government. And if that were so, these movements never would have been successful. So the idea that we can peacefully assemble, we can peacefully protest, we can use our voice to challenge the government and bring about change is so important to the evolution of our country and to the core of our constitutional republic. Another thing we need to talk about is hate speech or offensive speech. A lot of those movements wouldn't have existed either if the government was allowed to deem something as hate speech or offensive speech. Another thing that I touched on earlier, but speech itself cannot be restricted, only direct criminal actions. We recently saw the executive order from Trump about Antifa, and people are worried that's blurring the lines of peacefully assembling into a criminal act. The administration responded saying we're only addressing actions, not attacking speech. So that's likely a debate that will end up in the courts, as most of Trump's executive orders do. And we can talk about that as that progresses as well. If you guys think it would be helpful for me to give you guys just brief breakdowns of these cases or the outcomes and try to put them in plain English, I'm happy to do that. Just let me know and I could do just quick short videos on those. So like an incitement to imminent lawless action, you can look at Brandenburg v. Ohio, is already punishable. But beyond that expression, if it's not a threat, slanderous, again, those things that result in action shouldn't be infringed upon. And a lot of free speech absolutists acknowledge that speech can be ugly, immoral, it can be corrosive. But the solution to that is social pushback. It's counter speech. It's boycotts. It's cultural remedies, not government interference. What I struggle with a lot in today's day and age is so many Americans' first inclination is to run to the government to fix it. And that is absolutely not what we want. We do not want to give the government that power. We as a society have a lot of power to self-regulate hateful words, hateful behavior, unacceptable behavior, and we need to be doing a better job of that. And right now we're not, by a long shot. In short, you should fight speech with speech, not censorship, period. Hate speech is not speech that you hate, in the wise words of Michael Scott on The Office. So how does this all tie back to the Lorax? Well, that's where you come in. So the Lorax warns about what happens when greed and power go unchecked. And the most infamous quote and one of the last quotes in the book, it might be the last. It says, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. And we can make this comparison in that free speech is like the last truffle seed. And it only survives if citizens care enough to defend it. So the Constitution gives us the seed of free speech, but it is our responsibility and our civic duty as citizens of the United States to plant it and water it. And that could be free speech is the front line in that fight. So we have to either defend it or we risk losing it. And how can you defend it? Well, you can call your reps when there is bills or legislation introduced or are bills or legislation introduced that infringe or could be seen as infringement on freedom of speech. You can ensure your federal reps know that you are against the federal government communicating with social media companies to silence Americans, no matter what issue they feel they should be doing that. You can show up and testify against pending or introduced legislation. There were a lot of people that showed up to testify against the Kelly-Loving Act, and they were even able to have some of those provisions, which were related to custody, removed. And you can reaffirm to those around you that freedom of speech is nonpartisan. It's foundational to our constitutional republic, and every U.S. citizen should support free speech. You can support certain organizations by donating or volunteering, like FIRE.org, who I spoke about regarding the Kelly-Loving Act challenges, or the Alliance Defending Freedom organization. They also fight for free speech and have multiple Supreme Court victories under their belts, actually, of late. So, as President Ronald Reagan once reminded us, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on to our children. Free speech is the front line in that fight. So again, you defend it or you risk losing it. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today. Just a reminder, please subscribe, like, comment, rate the podcast, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.